Well, joining me now is another member of the U.S. Senate. This time, he's a Republican, Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. Senator, thanks so much for joining us. And do you also have very low expectations of a deal next week?
Well, good morning, Betty. Thanks for having me on. I really don't have expectations right now because I'm not sure what's going to happen. I know our guys and the folks on our side of the aisle, working in that committee are working hard to strike a deal. Betty, it just shouldn't be that hard. We're looking for about $1.2 to $1.5 trillion in savings.
Right.
I sent a letter to the committee within a week that showed about 1.4, had about 58 different items. And one thing I think is very important to talk about is nobody's really talking about cutting anything. We're just trying to limit the rate of increase in spending. Over the last 10 years, the federal government spent about $28 trillion. And the argument right now, the debate is over whether, according to President Obama's budget, we spend $46 trillion during the next 10 years, or according to the House budget, $40 trillion. So we're not cutting anything. We're just trying to reduce the rate of growth. This should not be that hard. And we shouldn't have to increase taxes in order to reduce the deficit. We should first be looking at how we reduce the rate of growth in spending.
Right, spending. And I would expect, Senator, that you would say that because obviously that is along with what your party has said before. Now, you mentioned that you sent a letter to the super committee asking them, giving them some items. So what are the items on the top of your agenda that you think should be cut right away to get to that number?
Well, again, it's just reducing the rate of growth. But the first one was just let the size of the federal workforce be reduced through attrition. So I'm not talking about firing or terminating anybody, but we've got about 400,000 workers about ready to retire. President Obama has increased the federal workforce 192,000 individuals, about 10% since he's taken office, while we've lost 2 million jobs. So why don't we just, through attrition, not hire additional people? That can reduce the federal workforce by 10% within 3 years. That would save $250 billion. Okay. And that'd be one place to start. Plus, we're also looking at a pretty interesting study by the American Enterprise Institute that if we just equalize pay between the federal workforce and the private sector, that could save $750 billion over the next decade. And again, we're looking at that study pretty carefully. It's simply unfair. Listen, I don't want to underpay people that work for the federal government or for the public sector, but we're not in a position where we can afford to overpay them either.
Right, and coming from the private sector, certainly you know about pay and equal pay, in private business. Now, Senator, let me just ask you about Jeb Hensarling, who says basically, look, the Republicans are not going to move any further in these talks. We're not going to move beyond talking about raising revenue by about $300 billion to try to close this gap until the Democrats come back with something on entitlement cuts. Is this helpful? Is this kind of dialogue helpful, though?
Well, listen, I didn't really like the whole concept of the super committee meeting in secret behind closed doors. I think this should be a very open debate. But the ground rules have really been let's hold these talks and let's maintain the confidentiality. So I certainly haven't appreciated the fact that people are coming out and saying what's happening behind closed doors. If you're going to agree to a set of rules, abide by that set of rules.
All right, and Senator, you are a freshman senator. You've just been elected, and it's your first time working there in Washington and as an elected politician. What's been most frustrating for you here?
Well, let's face it, the Senate, controlled by the Democrats, hasn't passed a budget in over 2 years. I'd say that's pretty frustrating. I come from the business world where a $10 million a year business probably has a budget, and they probably pass it every year. We haven't passed a budget on a $3.6 trillion a year federal entity. That's scandalous, quite honestly. How can you actually organize yourself? How can you have any hope of running the federal government properly if you're not even passing budgets? So that's been pretty frustrating.
And coming from the private sector, can you see why now it's difficult to create jobs? You coming from, your business was in plastics or is in plastics. Can you see how difficult it is to get Washington to create jobs in the private sector? And is there anything to break that?
Well, Bet, I've known that for years. One eye-popping figure that I have learned since I've come here is, according to the SBA, the total cost of complying with federal regulations every year is $1.75 trillion. Now, to put that in perspective, that's a larger number than all but 8 economies in the world. It's 12% of our economy. That's what we're burdening American businesses, job creators with every year. It doesn't surprise me that we're having a hard time creating jobs. We have to get the federal government off the backs of job creators. We have to make sure that America is an attractive place for business investment. We have to benchmark our tax rates. We have to benchmark our regulatory environment, and we've got to get this economy growing. It is the #1 component of the solution, economic growth. Everything we do here has to be targeted toward incentivizing businesses and consumers to spend and grow their businesses.
Okay, right. I mean, well, the only way to create jobs, as you say, is through economic
in the
growth.
Private sector.
In the long term, in the private sector.
Right.
Senator, thank you very much. Senator Ron Johnson joining us from the Hill.